January 1944. The European sky is a frozen ocean of grey. Below, 1,000 bombers thunder eastward, their silver wings glinting faintly in the dim winter sun. The air vibrates with the low, endless rumble of engines. Each crewman inside those flying fortresses knows the odds. Deep inside Germany, the Luftwaffe is waiting. But this morning feels different. High above and around the bomber streams, slender shadows dart through the clouds, not turning back at the Rhine, not running low on fuel. These are the new P-51 Mustangs, gleaming with polished metal and carrying 2 drop tanks beneath their wings. The tanks shimmer faintly in the thin air, filled not with promise, but with endurance. As German fighters rise to meet them, the Mustangs stay in formation. They do not retreat. They dive, turn, and fight, all the way to Berlin. For the first time, the bombers are not alone, and that changed everything. By the end of 1942, the skies over Europe had become a graveyard of Allied ambition. The United States Army Air Forces had entered the European campaign with a bold promise. Daylight precision bombing would cripple the German war machine. Factories, oil refineries, rail yards, all could be struck from the air with near surgical accuracy. In theory, this meant breaking Hitler's industrial backbone without destroying entire cities. Reality was far crueler. From the moment the first B-17s crossed into German airspace, they encountered a relentless storm of anti-aircraft fire and interception. The Luftwaffe, still powerful and deeply organized, struck with speed and precision. Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt 109 slashed through bomber formations with deadly effect. The Americans believed their heavy bombers could defend themselves with sheer firepower, 13 machine guns per plane, tight box formations, mutual protection. It worked for a while, but not for long. Every deep penetration raid ended in disaster. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, missions that were supposed to cripple the enemy's production lines, instead became blood-soaked lessons in arithmetic. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of aircraft never returned. Crews that did make it home spoke of skies littered with burning wrecks, parachutes drifting like snow over Germany's fields. The cause was simple but unsolved: range. Fighter escorts, particularly the P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engined P-38 Lightning, were capable machines. Yet both shared a fatal limitation: they could not escort bombers all the way to the target and back. Beyond a certain distance, their fuel gauges dictated retreat. The bombers had to fly the most dangerous stretches alone, unprotected, into the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe understood this weakness better than anyone. German controllers would track the progress of each raid, waiting patiently. Once Allied fighters turned for home, interceptors would strike in waves. Entire bomber groups vanished from the sky within minutes. By late 1943, the cost was unbearable. The 8th Air Force, based in England, faced loss rates that threatened to break the entire bombing campaign. In one mission over Schweinfurt, out of 291 bombers, 60 were shot down. 600 men lost in a single day. Commanders wrestled with the impossible. Cancel deep raids, and the war in Europe would stall. Continue them, and thousands more would die. The solution could only come from technology, something that could keep the escorts in the fight longer, much longer. But the clock was ticking. Each mission weakened the Allied air forces. While German industry continued to rebuild and rearm, the balance of power in the air had to shift, and fast. Far from the front lines, engineers and test pilots in Britain and the United States were already experimenting with a new kind of fighter, one that was faster, lighter, and capable of fighting far from home. The North American Aviation Company had been tasked to build a fighter for the British under contract. What emerged was sleek, purposeful, and unlike anything that had come before. The P-51 Mustang. Initially powered by an Allison engine, the Mustang was fast at low altitude, but weak at high altitude, where bomber formations operated. Then a daring idea took hold: fit it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance. The result was electric. Suddenly, the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and range farther than any other Allied fighter. Yet even the mighty Merlin-powered Mustang could not go deep enough. Its internal fuel still ran dry before Berlin. The aircraft was exceptional, but not invincible. What the Allied command needed was endurance. What they lacked was fuel. And somewhere in that gap, between ingenuity and necessity, the idea of the drop tank was about to take flight. The idea itself was deceptively simple: carry more fuel outside the aircraft. Yet in the early years of the war, external fuel tanks were considered impractical, even dangerous. Engineers feared they would drag down performance, compromise maneuverability, or burst into flames if hit. Fighter pilots, trained for speed and agility, dismissed the thought of carrying bulky tanks beneath their wings. But necessity has a way of silencing pride. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign stood on the brink of collapse. The German industrial heartland, Berlin, Leipzig, Munich, remained largely untouched. Each raid that ventured deeper into the Reich ended with crippling losses. Without long-range escort fighters, the promise of daylight precision bombing would die in the cold skies over Europe. Enter the engineers and innovators who refused to accept limits. At North American Aviation, designers began testing streamlined auxiliary fuel tanks. The concept wasn't new. Earlier models like the P-38 and P-47 had used them briefly for ferry flights. But those tanks were crude, often heavy, made of metal, and not optimized for combat. The Mustang, however, offered a unique opportunity. Its aerodynamic design and low drag made it ideal for carrying external loads without catastrophic performance loss. Experiments began with metal tanks, but wartime shortages of aluminum led to an unexpected innovation. Engineers at a small Ohio company developed a paper fuel tank made from laminated layers of resin-treated craft paper and glue. It was lightweight, inexpensive, and could be mass-produced quickly. The tanks were meant to be used once, jettisoned when empty, and replaced for the next mission. To everyone's surprise, they worked flawlessly. Each tank carried roughly 75 gallons of fuel. With two of them mounted beneath its wings, a P-51 Mustang could fly hundreds of miles farther, deep into Germany and back again. Suddenly, the war planner's impossible dream of continuous bomber escort became achievable. But innovation rarely spreads without resistance. Some pilots distrusted the new tanks, worrying they might rupture during takeoff or explode under fire. Others questioned the structural stress on the wings. Even among senior officers, skepticism lingered. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, initially believed that bombers could win the air war on their own. Escort fighters, he thought, were unnecessary. That belief collapsed under the brutal math of loss reports. When General James "Jimmy" Doolittle took command in January 1944, everything changed. Doolittle, already a legend for his daring Tokyo raid, understood the strategic stakes. He approved the widespread use of drop tanks for P-51 missions and redefined the purpose of fighter escorts. No longer would they simply defend bomber formations. Doolittle ordered them to seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it hid, on the ground, in the air, anywhere. This shift in doctrine turned the drop tank from a fuel container into a weapon of dominance. It extended the Mustang's range to over 1,500 miles, allowing it to stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Now the once invincible Luftwaffe would face Allied fighters over its own airfields. In early tests, pilots quickly adapted. The tanks were carried through the outbound journey, feeding fuel into the aircraft's main tanks. Once empty, they were released with a metallic clatter, tumbling into the clouds below. The P-51, suddenly lighter, became a pure hunter again, fast, agile, deadly. By spring 1944, the first fully escorted deep raids struck Berlin, Leipzig, and beyond. The bombers no longer flew alone. They were flanked by fighters that could fight from takeoff to landing, and within months, the balance of power in the air began to tilt irreversibly. The drop tank had done what no strategy, no command order, no sheer bravery could achieve. It made endurance a weapon. And that weapon would soon decide the fate of Europe's skies. Every revolution in warfare carries many faces: the engineer, the pilot, the commander, and the enemy forced to adapt. The story of the P-51 Mustang and its drop tanks is no different. It was a meeting point of courage and calculation, of human endurance and mechanical ingenuity. Each angle reveals how a simple cylinder of fuel transformed the very nature of air power. For the men who flew in the great bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, the difference between life and death could be measured in miles. Before the introduction of long-range escort fighters, every deep mission into Germany carried a grim rhythm. They would watch the friendly fighters peel away over Belgium or the Netherlands, knowing that from that point onward, they were on their own. Inside those tight, freezing cabins, crews would stare out into the endless blue, scanning for the black dots that always came. German fighters arrived like clockwork. Messerschmitts diving through the formations, 20 cannons tearing into aluminum hulls. There was no escape. A formation could lose 10-20 planes in minutes. The arrival of the drop tank, equipped Mustang changed that psychology overnight. The first time bomber crews saw P-51 still flying alongside them deep inside Germany, something intangible shifted. For the first time, they were not watching the clock, not counting the miles until abandonment. They were watching friends, guardians who stayed. Reports from the 8th Air Force described the difference vividly. Morale rose, casualties fell. Crews returned to base with fewer empty bunks in the barracks. And behind those survival statistics lay a simple truth. Men fought harder when they knew someone had their back all the way home. The drop tank was not elegant in appearance, but in purpose it was pure genius. Its design solved one of aviation's oldest constraints, the tyranny of range. The standard external tank for the P-51 was shaped like a teardrop, a form that minimized drag while maintaining fuel capacity. Each carried roughly 75 gallons, enough to extend flight time by hours. The tanks were connected by fuel lines feeding into the aircraft's internal system, automatically transferring fuel until empty. When that moment came, a pilot simply flipped a switch. The empty tanks dropped away, freeing the plane for combat. The paper tank, a wartime improvisation born from metal shortages, became one of the war's most unexpected innovations. It was made from layers of treated paper, bonded with resin and glue, light enough to be disposable yet strong enough to survive takeoff and climb. Pilots initially joked about flying into battle with cardboard wings, but the results silenced every skeptic. The tanks were so efficient that production lines in the United States churned them out by the tens of thousands. They were cheap, practical, and most importantly, expendable. The risk of carrying them was far outweighed by the strategic reach they provided. In the cold calculus of war, this was technological perfection, simple, reliable, deadly effective. Before the Mustang's transformation, Allied bombing strategy had been defensive by necessity. Every mission required careful planning around the escort's limited range. This forced bomber rates to avoid the deepest targets, a luxury Germany used to its advantage. Factories producing synthetic fuel, ball bearings and aircraft engines operated untouched, sustaining the Luftwaffe and prolonging the war. The introduction of drop tanks rewrote that map. Suddenly, the 8th Air Force could strike anywhere. Berlin, Munich, Dresden, even the heart of Prussia. No longer limited by escort range, mission planners selected targets based solely on strategic importance. The Luftwaffe, once the predator, became the hunted. German commanders could no longer mass their fighters at safe distance, knowing where the escorts would turn back. They now had to defend everywhere, stretching their forces thin. The Mustangs began escorting bombers on one leg of the mission, then ranging freely across the countryside, destroying enemy aircraft on the ground. Within weeks, fuel depots, airfields and transport lines came under relentless attack. The strategy shifted from survival to annihilation. Jimmy Doolittle's vision was ruthless and brilliant. Destroy the Luftwaffe not in the air, but before it could take off, and the drop tank made that strategy possible. By early spring 1944, the skies over Germany were beginning to change color, from the grey smoke of burning factories to the silver flash of Mustangs gliding at high altitude. Every aspect of air warfare, from morale to manufacturing, was being reshaped by one simple invention. But while the Allied side soared higher, the other side, the Luftwaffe, began to feel the crushing weight of inevitability. For the Luftwaffe, The arrival of the long-range Mustang was like watching the walls of a fortress crumble from within. Until early 1944, German Air Command had relied on a predictable pattern. They could estimate when Allied fighters would turn back and deploy interceptors only where bombers flew unescorted. The system worked. Their losses were sustainable, and their pilots, seasoned veterans from the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, dominated the skies. Then came the P-51, with drop tanks. The first time Luftwaffe radar detected Allied fighters still deep inside central Germany, confusion rippled through command posts. Intelligence officers assumed it was a mistake, perhaps local reconnaissance planes or strays from another mission. But as reports mounted of Mustangs escorting bombers near Berlin and Leipzig, realization turned to dread. The German fighter bases, once safe from direct air attack, were suddenly under siege. Mustang squadrons, freed from fuel limits, prowled over enemy territory for hours. They strafed parked aircraft, ambushed interceptors as they climbed, and even attacked trains carrying aviation fuel and spare parts. The Luftwaffe's carefully trained aces began to fall faster than they could be replaced. Pilots who had once hunted bombers with confidence now faced agile escorts that could outclimb, outturn, and outlast them. One German officer later wrote that the war in the air ended not with a battle but with exhaustion. The Luftwaffe was bled white, not by numbers alone but by the relentless presence of an enemy that never left. The transformation from desperation to dominance did not happen by accident. It was shaped by leadership willing to challenge doctrine. General Jimmy Doolittle's arrival at the 8th Air Force in January 1944 marked a turning point. He understood that technology alone would not win the skies. Strategy had to evolve with it. Doolittle's first act was to rewrite the fighter escort rulebook. Until then, pilots were ordered to stay close to bomber formations at all times. He saw the flaw immediately. This rigid protection meant the Luftwaffe could mass its fighters, strike hard, and retreat unchallenged. His solution was bold. Unleash the fighters. Let them range ahead, sweep the skies, and destroy the Luftwaffe before it could organize. The drop tank made this doctrine viable. With extended range, Mustangs could operate offensively, turning from bodyguards into hunters. His orders echoed across every squadron briefing room in England. Go find the enemy and kill him. Doolittle's command philosophy liberated his pilots and terrified his adversaries. P-51 squadrons began to roam freely, sometimes breaking from bomber routes entirely to strike airfields and assembly points. By removing the last constraint, fuel, he transformed a defensive air force into an unstoppable spearhead. Under his leadership, air superiority was no longer an abstract goal. It became an everyday reality. Every technological advance in war carries a moral shadow. The drop tank allowed bombers to strike deeper than ever before, and those deeper raids brought devastation on a scale unseen in earlier years. With long-range escort now possible, the Allies expanded their strategic bombing campaign, targeting not just factories but entire urban centers tied to industrial output. Leipzig, Dresden, Berlin, cities that had once been beyond reach now burned beneath Allied bombs. The lines between military and civilian blurred under the doctrine of total war. For aircrews, the question was not morality but survival. They followed orders, carried out missions, and trusted that each sortie would shorten the war. Yet even among them, letters and diaries reveal moments of reflection, awareness that endurance brought both protection and destruction. Historians still debate whether the extended bombing campaign hastened Germany's defeat or deepened its suffering. But what remains undeniable is the paradox of progress. The same innovation that saved lives in the air also magnified tragedy on the ground. The P-51's drop tanks were not designed for conquest or cruelty. They were built to solve a tactical problem. Yet by solving it, they gave the Allies the power to reach anywhere, and with that reach came consequences no invention could fully control. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's power was visibly collapsing. Its aces were gone, its new recruits poorly trained, its aircraft destroyed faster than they could be replaced. In the air, the Mustangs owned the daylight. And from that dominance would emerge the next great struggle, not for the skies themselves, but for the heart of Europe. The drop tanks had extended the reach of Allied power, and that reach now pointed toward D-Day. The winter of 1944 marked the moment when endurance became victory. Over the frozen fields of Northern Europe, the 8th Air Force prepared for the most daring missions ever attempted, full-scale bombing raids deep into the German heartland. These were not just strikes of destruction, but tests of a new promise. Could the P-51 Mustang, equipped with its drop tanks, truly escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back? On the 4th of March 1944, that question was answered. The mission that morning was unprecedented. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses took off from English bases under heavy cloud. Their destination, the German capital itself. In the lead formations were the silver streaks of P-51 Mustangs, each carrying 2 slender drop tanks beneath its wings. The tanks glistened faintly as the sun rose through the haze, holding the extra fuel that would decide whether the bombers lived or died. Hours later, as the formations crossed the North Sea and reached the German frontier, ground radar screens lit up across the Reich. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, expecting as always that the Allied escorts would soon turn back. They waited, but the Mustangs kept coming. Over the outskirts of Berlin, German interceptors finally appeared, dozens of Messerschmitt 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S, climbing fast. The sky erupted in contrails and flashes of tracer fire, but this time, something was different. The Mustangs stayed. They met the German fighters head-on, diving into dogfights above the rooftops of Berlin itself. For the first time in the war, Allied bombers reached the German capital with full fighter escort. The results were staggering. Only a fraction of the attacking bombers were lost, far fewer than on earlier deep raids. Luftwaffe commanders were stunned. Their defensive network, designed to exploit the escort gap, was now obsolete overnight. Reports from that mission echoed across every airfield in England. Pilots who returned spoke of the surreal moment when the drop tanks ran dry and were jettisoned. A synchronized shedding of weight before combat, the tanks spinning away into the clouds like falling stars. With their main fuel reserves still full, the Mustangs had energy to spare for dogfights. They outturned, outclimbed and outlasted every German interceptor sent against them. The following weeks turned the Berlin raid from a triumph into a routine. Allied commanders planned consecutive deep strikes, Leipzig, Brunswick, Munich, all under the constant protection of long-range escorts. The once mighty Luftwaffe was now trapped in a war of attrition it could not win. The statistics told the story with cold precision. In late 1943, bomber loss rates often reached 10% or higher per mission, a level that made sustained operations impossible. By spring 1944, those losses had dropped by more than half. Fighter cover had achieved what armor and formation tactics never could: safety through presence. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, the shift was palpable. Missions once described as suicide runs became survivable. The bombers pressed deeper into the industrial heartland, hitting oil plants, rail networks, and synthetic fuel facilities. German industry began to choke. And at the center of it all, 2 small tanks of fuel, carried beneath silver wings. The Luftwaffe tried to respond. They modified tactics, sending their fighters to climb higher or attack from head-on angles, hoping to bypass the escorts. But every adaptation met a counter. The Mustangs were faster at altitude, more stable in dive recovery, and deadly in pursuit. By May 1944, the air over Central Europe no longer belonged to the Reich. Daylight skies were ruled by Allied wings. The Mustang's range meant that no airfield, no convoy, no squadron could hide. For the German pilots who still took to the air, survival became a matter of luck rather than skill. Even the aces who had survived years of combat began to fall. The balance of experience tilted sharply toward the Allies. The long-range escort had achieved its ultimate purpose, to clear the skies for what would come next. Beneath those contrails of victory, the invasion of Normandy was already being prepared. The P-51 Mustang had not only changed the course of air warfare, it had opened the door to the liberation of Europe. By early summer 1944, the skies over Europe had become the Allies' greatest weapon. The P-51 Mustang, now mass-deployed and armed with its unassuming drop tanks, turned every daylight raid into a symbol of unstoppable momentum. The Luftwaffe, once the shield of the Reich, was unraveling, not through sudden collapse, but through constant, inescapable erosion. The true climax of this transformation came not from a single dogfight, but from a slow, merciless strangling of Germany's air defences. When General Doolittle gave his order for fighters to pursue and destroy the enemy wherever found, the results were immediate. P-51 squadrons began sweeping far ahead of bomber formations, engaging interceptors before they could reach their targets. Others flew low over airfields, destroying aircraft as they taxied or refueled. These were not random attacks, they were systematic. The drop tanks made it possible to spend hours over enemy territory, hitting one base after another before returning home. The Luftwaffe's own reports from that period tell the story in despairing tones. Between February and May 1944, German fighter losses exceeded those of the previous 2 years combined. Veteran pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. By the time of the Allied invasion in June, only a fraction of Germany's once mighty fighter strength remained combat-ready. The Mustang had achieved what no bombing raid alone could. It destroyed the Luftwaffe from within. For the bomber crews, the difference was night and day. Where once they had flown through gauntlets of cannon fire, now they crossed the German frontier under the protective arcs of P-51 Say. They could focus on their targets rather than survival. Mission briefings grew shorter, casualty lists thinner. The air war had shifted from desperate endurance to confident control. And yet, even in triumph, the scenes above Germany were brutal. Air battles still raged daily, sometimes involving hundreds of aircraft, contrails tangled like threads of smoke in the thin air. The Mustang's extended range meant pilots fought until ammunition and fuel ran out, often far from home. Many never returned. But each mission brought the Allies closer to total air dominance. By March, Allied bombers were striking oil refineries at Lohne, aircraft factories at Regensburg, and rail networks feeding the Eastern Front. These were the arteries of the German war machine. Without them, the tanks, trucks, and planes that sustained Hitler's armies began to die on the ground. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe's strategic position disintegrated. Fuel shortages grounded training squadrons. Replacement aircraft sat idle on airfields without crews or petrol. The same fuel the Mustangs carried in their drop tanks was now the resource Germany could no longer produce or protect. It was a cruel symmetry. The weapon that extended the Allies' reach had cut off the enemy's. By the eve of D-Day, the air situation was beyond recovery. In the days leading up to the Normandy landings, Allied reconnaissance and fighter-bomber patrols ruled the sky. German aircraft attempting to interfere were intercepted almost immediately, many within minutes of takeoff. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, played almost no role in the defense of France. And while the drop tanks themselves were small, their influence rippled through every decision of the campaign. The invasion planners could proceed, knowing their forces would have near total air cover. Bombers could isolate the beaches by destroying bridges, roads, and railways. Paratroopers could drop without fear of aerial attack. Every movement of the Allied ground army unfolded beneath an invisible shield sustained by fuel carried in disposable tanks. The long-range Mustang had done more than win the air war. It had cleared the path for the liberation of a continent. When historians later examined the numbers, the evidence was overwhelming. In less than 6 months, the Luftwaffe had lost its capacity to contest the air. Thousands of aircraft destroyed, hundreds of pilots lost, entire commands rendered ineffective. The decisive edge was not a new weapon or secret tactic, but an idea to carry the sky a little farther. In the aftermath of those victories, the P-51 Mustang became more than a machine. It became a symbol of endurance, of what happens when ingenuity meets necessity. And as Allied troops began their march across France, the same Mustangs that had once escorted bombers now roamed the skies freely, hunting retreating columns and striking wherever resistance dared to rise. The war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The turning point had passed, carried on silver wings and sustained by 2 humble tanks of fuel. When the dust settled over Europe's skies, the change was unmistakable. By the summer of 1944, the 8th Air Force had achieved what seemed impossible only a year before: complete daylight air superiority over the continent. The drop tank had made endurance the Allies' most lethal weapon, and the P-51 Mustang had become its blade. Before the introduction of long-range escort, the life expectancy of a bomber crew flying deep into Germany was measured in missions, not months. The official records were chilling. In late 1943, bomber loss rates on deep raids often hovered around 10%. That meant a crew had little chance of surviving 25 missions, the standard tour of duty. By the spring of 1944, the numbers told a new story. Loss rates dropped sharply, sometimes below 3%, even on long-range raids to Berlin. The difference was not luck or better formations. It was the steady silver presence of Mustangs that never turned back. Every statistic carried a human weight. Thousands of airmen who might have been lost were now coming home. The change was visible in the English countryside, where returning bombers once limped in alone, riddled with holes. Now entire groups returned together, their formations intact. Ground crews who had grown used to counting the missing now greeted full squadrons. The German side told a mirror image of the same story. The Luftwaffe, stripped of its veteran corps, was reduced to desperation. Records from the German Air Ministry reveal a steady decline in sortie rates, often due to fuel shortages or lack of pilots. By July 1944, some frontline units could only manage a handful of operational aircraft. Captured Luftwaffe officers described the psychological shift that accompanied these losses. Where once they had chosen when and where to fight, they now scrambled merely to survive. Allied Mustangs, often flying multiple missions a day, dominated the airfields from France to Poland. German pilots who once took pride in aerial mastery now faced overwhelming numbers, relentless pursuit, and exhaustion. The drop tank had extended the reach of Allied strategy far beyond the visible horizon. It turned fighter escort from a local defense into a global concept. The bombers no longer needed to operate on the edge of safety. They could strike oil refineries, transportation hubs, and communication lines at will. In one remarkable report, analysts noted that German aviation fuel production fell by more than 50% in the months following the first long-range raids. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's aircraft sat idle, and without air cover, Germany's armies on the ground faced the full weight of Allied air power. The synergy between the P-51 and the drop tank reshaped not only battles, but strategy itself. Air supremacy was no longer about who built the fastest plane or who had the bravest pilots. It was about who could stay in the air longer, reach farther, and control the tempo of war. The results were seen across every front. Allied bombers now struck enemy positions with near impunity. Rail networks collapsed under sustained attack. Convoys moving at night were discovered and destroyed by roaming Mustangs. Even the feared German jet project, the Me-262, arrived too late to change the tide. When it appeared, the Luftwaffe no longer had the fuel or infrastructure to deploy it effectively. The war in the air had become one-sided, and it was endurance, not firepower, that decided it. By the time the Allied armies crossed the Rhine in 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become the airborne symbol of victory. Its silhouette, with drop tanks glinting beneath its wings, was a sight every soldier recognized, a guardian in the daylight, a promise that the skies were secure. But even as triumph filled the airfields of England, engineers and strategists were already asking new questions. Could this principle, carrying more fuel to go farther, reshape the future of aviation itself? The answer, as the coming decades would prove, was yes. When historians trace the chain of innovation that turned the tide in Europe, the P-51's drop tank stands as one of the quiet revolutions of the war. It was not loud or glamorous like a new cannon or a jet engine. It did not explode, fire, or destroy. Instead, it gave time, the one element of combat that no pilot ever had enough of. In official post-war studies, U.S. Army Air Forces analysts concluded that the introduction of long-range escort fighters, made possible by the drop tank, directly accelerated the collapse of German air defense. The analysis pointed to a simple but devastating pattern. Every extra mile the P-51 could fly was another factory, airfield, or fuel depot that could be reached and destroyed. The success of the drop tank also transformed production priorities. By early 1944, American industry had begun producing external tanks in enormous quantities, thousands every month. Factories in the United States, Britain, and even the newly liberated parts of France joined the effort. Most were made from light sheet metal, but some were molded from resin-impregnated paper to save aluminum. They were cheap, disposable, and effective. The sheer scale of this production told a deeper story about how the Allies fought the war. Unlike the Axis, which often relied on precision craftsmanship and limited resources, the United States embraced mass innovation. Every small advancement, a better tank weld, a new drop mechanism, a slightly more aerodynamic shape, was multiplied across thousands of aircraft. Incremental progress became overwhelming advantage. German pilots recognized the transformation almost instantly. When the Mustangs came, the air turned deadly, wrote one Luftwaffe ace in his memoirs. They could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin. We had no place left to run. His words captured the quiet despair that had begun to spread through the German air forces. The skies that once belonged to them were now hostile territory. By mid-1944, the Allied air campaign had effectively cut Germany off from the outside world. Strategic bombing, escorted by Mustangs, destroyed oil refineries in Romania, transportation hubs across France, and synthetic fuel plants deep within the Reich. Even the vaunted armored divisions of the Wehrmacht found themselves immobilized, not from lack of steel, but from lack of gasoline. In the months leading up to D-Day, the drop tank again proved its worth. Long-range P-51 patrols roamed the skies over northern France, hunting trains, trucks, and troop movements. When the invasion came in June, Allied aircraft maintained a near-constant presence overhead. The Luftwaffe's response was fragmented and sporadic. In the first 48 hours of the Normandy invasion, fewer than 200 German sorties were recorded, a fraction of what had once been possible. After the war, engineers studied the data carefully. The lessons went beyond the Mustang. The drop tank concept became a cornerstone of modern air strategy. Every new generation of fighter, from the jet-powered Sabre to the supersonic Phantom, carried its legacy. Flexibility, range, and endurance became as vital as speed and firepower. The P-51's drop tank also influenced the coming age of aerial refueling. Military planners understood that if external tanks could extend range in combat, then in-flight refueling could extend it indefinitely. The simple steel and paper tanks of 1944 had opened the door to global air operations. Yet among veterans, the legacy was not measured in design blueprints or tactical manuals. It was measured in lives. Pilots and bomber crews remembered what it meant to see those twin tanks under the wings of an escorting Mustang. They meant someone would be there when the flak burst, when the fighters came, when the mission seemed endless. The tank symbolized endurance and hope. In the final accounting, the P-51 and its drop tank were not just technical achievements. They were proof of a larger truth, that the side which could adapt fastest, think simplest, and sustain longest, would master the air. From that revelation grew the air doctrines of the Cold War, the jet age, and beyond. The skies over Europe were silent now, but the echo of that innovation, light, cylindrical, and full of fuel, would carry far into the future. When history looks back at the Second World War, it often remembers the great machines, the tanks that rumbled through Europe, the bombers that filled the sky, the ships that crossed oceans. Yet sometimes victory was shaped, not by the loudest weapons, but by the quietest ideas. The P-51 Mustang was already a masterpiece of design, fast, agile, and deadly. But without endurance, it was a blade that could not reach its target. The drop tank gave it wings that stretched beyond the map. It turned a fighter into a guardian, a symbol of persistence in a war that demanded it above all else. That small, streamlined tank beneath each wing represented more than just extra miles of fuel. It embodied an idea that ingenuity, when paired with courage, can turn limitation into strength. The Allied engineers who sketched its curves on paper in some quiet office could not have known that their creation would help secure the skies over Europe, shorten the war, and save thousands of lives. In the years that followed, aviation would continue to evolve. Jets, missiles, and computers would redefine the battlefield. Yet the principle born in 1944 remained the same: range is power, endurance is survival, and the simplest solutions often change the course of history. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang and its drop tank endures in every aircraft that now crosses oceans without pause, in every mission planned with the confidence that distance no longer defines limitation. The Mustang's sleek form may rest in museums today, silent and still, but in that silence lies a reminder that behind every act of heroism, there was also invention, and behind every victory, a quiet mind that looked at a problem and saw possibility. In the end, the drop tank was not merely a tool of war, it was a testament to human persistence, proof that in the vast uncertain sky, endurance is the greatest weapon of all.